Well, hey there, everyone, and welcome to episode number 14 of the Just Asia podcast. My name is Kevin O'Shea. I am a Canadian who lives and works in Asia. I'm currently based in Shenzhen, China, but just for a few more weeks. And I'm going to be on my way out of China after 6 years of working and living here with my family. And we're on the road to new adventures. Now, last week, Jason Reagan took the time to sit down with us here at the podcast, and it was a fantastic story he shared of his very interesting life and what he's doing right now in Beijing, China. And I want to thank all of you for listening and giving me such positive feedback on the podcast. I've really heard some great things. So yeah, some updates since last week. Quickly, I'll shout out the Arthropod, which is the entomology podcast. I was interviewed by Dr. Jody Green for the latest episode of the Arthropod. There will be a link below in the show notes. And the episode is all about me being a bug-loving educator. So someone who uses insects in education. And I use bugs, live bugs, real bugs, and all kinds of things about bugs to connect children with nature and to teach them the importance of biodiversity and the importance of nature. And it's all kind of my lifelong quest to create new generations of environmental stewards. So the link will be in the show notes below, but go check out my interview where I was interviewed. The roles were reversed and I was the interviewee on the latest episode of the Arthropod, which is a very science-heavy, insect-heavy podcast. But I'm a fanboy of it, so it was pretty exciting for me to be on it. So this week in the podcast, for episode number 14, we're taking a pop over to Korea for the first time. And I am chatting with Shawn Morrissey, who is a Canadian who has been living in South Korea for more than 20 years, and he does some pretty fascinating things. He works in the travel industry, and he's a guide. He's a professional guide. He's a researcher, a folklorist, a historian, a writer. He does a lot of things, wears a lot of hats. And what's really cool is that I first met Shawn back in 2002 when I was an English teacher in South Korea. And he was an English teacher at that time. He has long since left that profession and moved on to some very different ones, very different things. And you're going to hear all about that. So for all of you fine folks out there listening to the Just Asia podcast, sit back and listen to my interview with Shawn Morrissey, a Canadian, a long-term expat in South Korea, who teaches people and shows people the darker side of Korea. Ooh, scary. Just Asia listeners, we're back for another episode, and I'm really happy to introduce Shawn Morrissey. And Shawn is coming to us from Korea today. And I was wondering, Shawn, if you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and where you're from and what you do in Korea.
Sure, yeah. At first, thanks, Kevin, for having me on. I'll say a lot of people probably don't know that we met for the first time probably over 20 years ago.
Yeah. Over 20 years ago, we met in Ilsan, South Korea. And I was when I was there as an English teacher, I think probably would have been my first year or second year. I got there in February of 2002 is when I arrived in Korea.
Okay, right.
And
okay,
but it was a bit of time. It was a little bit of time after that before I met you actually.
I think it was right. That's right. Yeah, those are good days, man. Back at Don't Go and stuff like that.
Those were no days. That's something that may come up later in the podcast, maybe too.
Maybe
a little bit, a smidgen
okay.
of stuff. Not too many details. Yeah, but
right.
But yeah, so you're in Korea, and yes. Can you let the listeners know? A little bit about who you are.
Yeah, well, I'm from Canada, same coast as you. I'm from but one province over. I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador, and I am. When I first came to Korea, I've been in Korea now 23 years. I came as an English teacher, and that's pretty much how I think people get their start in Korea. They come as teachers. I moved away from teaching. I don't teach anymore. I always had it in the back of my mind to get into tourism. Mm-hmm. And so eventually that's what happened. And so I left teaching as a full-time job, maybe around 2007 or 8.
Oh, really? That long ago. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. It's been a while. And so just did it part-time because I needed to make money still. Yeah. And I started off got into tourism studies, and heritage studies is actually my background.
Okay.
And heritage research and heritage interpretation, which is essentially a form of communication that's used in the tourism industry. It's used by docents and in museology and things like that. But specifically, I use it as a professional guide. And the background of my interest in heritage is folklore. So I'm very deeply interested in folklore, and being a Newfoundlander, and you as a Nova Scotian as well, there's a ton of folk traditions in Eastern Canada. And I grew up just bathed in that stuff, ghost stories and certain days of the year where you do certain things. And so it was just part of my background. And then, I turned it into a career. And now I work pretty much full time as a tour guide.
That's awesome. And we're gonna get more into that as we progress through the conversation. But I find that fascinating. I mean, I just like within my own family. I mean, I grew up in Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, and my father worked his entire career for Parks Canada, and he was a resource manager at the Fortress of Louisbourg, a historian.
Right.
And actually, my son just finished writing a biography about my father for
no way
for his humanities grade 7 humanities class. And actually, my father was the first superintendent of he was the first superintendent of Castle Hill in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. And
Newfoundland.
And he was also superintendent of Signal Hill National Historic Site in Newfoundland before. And
I've been to both.
Yeah, and it just I grew up with working at the Fortress of Louisbourg as an animator, a historical animator during my summers. My mother was a tour guide, professional tour guide there for her entire career until she retired. So this is all stuff I'm familiar with. And being a Cape Bretoner, I'm also someone who loves folklore. When I was going to university at the University of Cape Breton, I ate up all the kind of local folklore books I could in the library, and love the superstitions of the people of Cape Breton and the East Coast of Canada. And I found that for myself anyway, when I lived in Japan, I didn't know so much in my days in Korea, but in Japan anyways, I married a Japanese person and got to know more. I was really enthralled with the superstitions that they had in Japan, and how there was a lot of this kind of interesting kind of weaving of those superstitions, similar things, But yeah. And it's really cool. And I'll jump into your podcast in a little bit. But before we go into that, I'm curious. And it's one of the things that I love doing this podcast about, is talking to really interesting people in different countries and finding out how they ended up where they are, especially people who, you just mentioned you've been in Korea for 23 years. And I think maybe a lot of us who are English teachers had similar stories, but what got you there? And how'd that happen? What was your Korea origin story?
Yeah, it's a bit interesting to me, I guess. Anyway, but I had moved away from Newfoundland, and I went to Ontario, Northern Ontario, in Sudbury. Sudbury. Then I was down in Kitchener, and then I moved out to BC, and I became a tree planter there. Got hurt tree planting. And then looked into options, things to do, and I was studying and whatnot. But I decided to. I was 21, and I thought, hey, well, I'm studying, but I can also travel. And it just kind of occurred to me that I could travel. It's like, I don't have to stay here. And I was always interested in East Asian culture, especially Japan and China, but mostly just through studying on my own. And I read so many books, and I was really interested in Taoism and Buddhism and the philosophy Zen and whatnot. And just kind of stuff I picked up on my own. But I didn't know very much about Korea. The only thing I really knew about Korea was that it was in East Asia, and there was a war in the 20th century at some point. And I think I remember that just because, like, from high school history class, like 20th century history. Yeah. And I think we only learned that because Canada fought in the war. That's the only reason I knew about it. Yeah. And it's not like today where Korea's pop culture is really expanding. It's becoming way more well known. Yeah. But not then, not back then. Yeah. No, not 99. Yeah. No. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to travel. I'm going to save up. I can keep studying, but I can travel. and I'll go to Korea. I'll learn about Korea in Korea, and that'll be the first place outside of North America that I'll visit.
Yeah.
And I arrived. I fell in love with it pretty quick. I was in a romantic stage for quite a while, and I knew after a month I was going to stay a year. I remember the moment. I was in the housing provided to me by the Hagwon, which was, for anyone who doesn't know, it's the English Academy that I worked at. And I was looking at the window. I was in Juyop. You remember Juyop Station?
Yeah, I lived there for a brief period of a couple of months while a school owner kind of bounced me around between a couple of apartments. But yeah, I remember that area for sure.
Right. So I was there and I was looking out the window in Juyop, and it struck me, I'm going to stay longer. I'm staying at least another year. Mm-hmm. And that romantic period lasted for quite some time. And I got into Korean culture and not so much into the history, a bit, but mostly into the heritage and the folklore and whatnot pretty quick, probably within my second year. And I really started learning a lot about it. And that was it. That's what kind of set me on my way.
Cool. So that's something I was really curious about, that love of Korean folklore and history. Like when I listened to you on the Dark Side of Seoul podcast, which you co-host with Joe McPherson, you guys talk a lot about history and a lot about folklore. Obviously, it's a topical podcast, and I've listened to quite a few episodes, and you definitely know your stuff. You're well read, and you're clearly something that it comes through that you're very passionate about. You care deeply about. And I can remember, now this could be a foggy memory, but I remember years ago, like a lot of my memories in those days were foggy, but I can remember years ago, one of the times when maybe I hadn't known you very long, but I can remember, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you had written some books, or you had published a book quite early on in your days there. Am I correct? I can remember this going to me in a bar at one point, not long after I met you, that something, and it was about hiking. Am I right? Or something about mountains?
It was poetry.
Poetry. Okay.
Yeah, it was a book of poetry about Korea, and there were a lot of books, or there were a lot of poems that were set in the mountains. I had a whole chapter about mountain.
Because I remember our conversations back 20 some years ago, and you were right. Such an enthusiastic hiker. And I can remember you talking about like all the Pukan-san and all the different places you've been going to. And I was pretty impressed because one of my memories of you was that, a lot of people we met in those days back in the 2000s teaching English in that scene may not really have had their stuff together, we shall say.
We were young,
but some people, and partied a little harder than others. And I can remember seeing that you had published a book, and you were so enthusiastic about this stuff. And for me, that set you apart from maybe some of the other riffraff, which I may or may not have been guilty of being sometimes.
I was definitely part of the riffraff.
You're part of the riffraff. That was me. We've matured. We've matured greatly.
Okay. Well, slow down.
Okay. So I mean, you've got this passion for folklore, and it's something that you said earlier that it's something that you kind of grew up with. Being a Newfoundlander, I mean, I know that people from Newfoundland are storytellers, and that's one of the things I love about podcasting. It's such a modern form of documenting storytelling and sharing stories. But I'd like to dig a little deeper into, or just not maybe. I'm curious. I suppose I know the reasons why you've been in Korea so long, but I'm curious when I do meet an expat who has been either in China or Japan or Korea for 20 years. What's kept you there? Because I mean, it really is a revolving door. I mean, I remember being in South Korea like in the early 2000s and signing like my third contract and having people say, "Man, you're a lifer." Like,
all right,
you're gonna be here for 3 years, lifer. You're a lifer, like in such a pejorative way. And I stayed in Korea for 5 years. It was all together, and then I left and moved on to different things. Mostly, I'd met my soon to be Japanese wife in Korea, in Busan. And that's why I left Korea. Yeah. I met her in Korea. What is, I mean, yeah, I suppose I know some of the reasons, but what has kept you there for 20 some years?
Yeah. Well, in my 5th year, I guess I was going into my 5th year. It was around 2005, I think it was. I was prepping to leave, and I had fallen in love with Nepal.
Okay, yeah.
And I've been to the Himalaya, and took a big trip there with Luke, a friend of ours.
Okay, yeah, mutual friend.
Yeah. Luke also from Nova Scotia, and so I just completely fell in love with with Nepal, and I was enamored with it, and the mountain culture, and it was a new thing. I had been in Korea 5 years, and I thought, okay, I'm going to move on. And I said, if I ever want to come back to Korea, it will be here. So I'll try something else. I had really nothing. I didn't really have anything in Korea keeping me here at the time. Yeah. And so I was looking. I had a dog. I don't know if you remember. I had a big dog back in the day.
I remember.
Lakota. And so I was looking into getting him to Nepal, like how I would do it, vaccinate, whatever, that stuff you have to go through. And so looking into it, and right around that time, actually, I had gone to Japan, and I hiked up Fuji.
Okay, yeah.
And met with, I think, also a mutual friend, Japanese friend, Hidofumi.
Okay,
yeah. So met Hido in he picked me up in Narita, and then we went to his parents' house and hung out, and we went up Fuji and whatnot. And the whole time I was in Fuji, I was loving it. And then I was thinking, it's like, yeah, I'm going to go to Nepal. This was in the back of my head. Mm-hmm. And then I came back to Korea, and we had a big party at Funky in Hongdae.
Okay.
Do you remember that place?
No, I don't.
Don't? Okay.
No.
Okay. So, and so it was one of those underground live.
Well, maybe I was there, but I don't remember.
Right.
And we won't say why, because I'm old.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So, and then it just so happened that night I met a cute girl.
Oh.
And 7 months later, we were married.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And now we're going to soon celebrate our 18th wedding anniversary.
Very cool. And that's amazing.
That's it.
And you hear those interesting stories. I just in the episode of a recent episode of the podcast I published with a guy in Japan, Casey Bean. He's from the United States, and he met his Japanese wife at university in America. And I met my Japanese wife. She was teaching Japanese in Busan, and I was in Busan. I moved down to Busan after a few years in the kind of Seoul area. And there you are. That's awesome. But now you've transitioned into tourism quite a while ago. So It's an interesting thing. Often, you meet, foreigners who are living in Korea, who are in Japan, different places, who are teaching, working as English teachers, ESL teachers, and you can often meet a lot of very negative people who are in that job that they hate, they resent it, they kind of feel themselves in it, and they just wish they could get into something else, and they kind of lament and complain year after year after year after year. And then you also meet people who have made interesting shifts in their careers. How did you? That wouldn't have been an obvious choice for me, I suppose, or not something I would have thought of. How did you make that transition into tourism? Like, tell us a little bit about
that. It was I think I mentioned that earlier. I was that it was always kind of something that was in the back of my mind. I always figured I'd get into tourism.
How does a guy from Newfoundland, Canada, get into tourism in South Korea?
Right. Well, it wasn't a quick transition or anything like that. So back in the day when you were still here, I was already kind of taking people on hikes up through Pukansan National Park.
I remember that. I remember you would take groups of friends and stuff up on hikes, and people would want to hang out with you because you knew the area well.
Yeah, and so it kind of went from there initially.
Okay.
And then I thought, I can make money doing this. I want to get into tourism, so I may as well charge. And this was after I had gotten married. And so then I became a permanent resident.
Okay.
And then my visa status allowed me to essentially do whatever I want.
Yeah.
As long as I pay taxes, and I'm paying taxes, and then a mortgage, and own a car, and all that fun stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So that was pretty much it. I just realized that I've wanted to always do this. I have been doing it. Now I can actually make a living out of it. And so I went back to school.
Okay.
And then studied. That's when I did the heritage studies.
Okay.
Studied tourism development, delivery, content delivery, things like that. And then became a heritage researcher, but specifically geared towards tourism.
Okay.
So
did you
and then that was
Korea? Did you study in Korea, or was that something you did like
online through Canada? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Through Canadian school. Cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Very neat.
Yeah.
It's interesting how we kind of pivot, in life. I myself, and I share this story sometimes on various podcasts I host and have been on. But I mean, when I came to Korea, that was my gap year. Essentially, I was actually working. I was working in the IT industry. I was a game development guy. I had graduated from university with a Bachelor of Arts, and then I later went to New Brunswick Community College and did electronic game design for 2 years, got a diploma, and I was a 3D graphics guy, and I actually worked in Moncton doing game development, and had the wanderlust and decided I would travel, and teaching English was a way to do it, to get a free plane ticket to Korea, and and then after 5 years of that, and I met my Japanese wife, and I decided to go back to university in Canada, and I got my teaching degree. I got my bachelor in primary ed, and that's how I ended up doing what I do now. So now I'm an international school teacher. So completely, which allows me to be in a big recording studio that belongs to me. Right. Doesn't belong to me. It's not my house. It's a high school.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is people always comment when they see photos of the recording studio. They're like, "That's amazing." I'm like, "It's not mine."
All right. But this is my tiny place.
It's interesting how people make those pivots, and change. So the Dark Side of Seoul tours and your hiking tours. I of course have not been to Korea in a long time. And if I do get to go, I would like to go. I'd like to bring my family there. I know my wife really wants to head back to Korea. I would love to go on one of your tours. So tell us about the Dark Side of Seoul, and then also tell us about your hiking tours. What are they all about? Because they sound cool.
So I'll say the hiking tours first, I guess, because that was they stem directly, like I was saying, directly from how I pivoted into tourism.
Yeah.
So I do the Seoul Hike. And that name is entirely SEO. That's search engine optimization. Seoul Hike.
Yeah.
Seoul Hike, but the historic trail. Excuse me. And so we go to a section of the national park, Pukansan National Park, which is the national park that is famously north of Seoul. And despite what a lot of websites say, most of the park is actually not in Seoul. Most of it is in Gyeonggi-do, and in Goyang City, Goyang-si, which is Ilsan, and in Uijeongbu. So that's where actually most of the park is located. So I was going there for so long, and then developed the Seoul Hike after I had started doing the Dark Side of Seoul.
Yeah.
And I was talking with my partner, Joe McPherson, and who owns the tour company that I work for. But and I said to him, I don't know why I didn't think of this before, but let's add a hiking tour to the itinerary. And he's like, yes, we don't have one of those. Can you do that? I'm like, oh boy, can I? No problem. I said, I already know what the route is. I know the content, and I've done it already. So all we have to do is do the marketing, set it all up, and we're good to go. And we I don't quite remember how long it took us to set it up, but it wasn't very long, because tour development can take a long time. Yeah. But we had the benefit of me having already done hiking tours before. Just had to turn it into something marketable for the company, and then set it out. And I just finished one today. I was doing one of these tours today, a Seoul Hike tour. I had 3 people, 2 different groups, a group of 2 and a group of 1. It was great. So we go up, we hike, we go through the trails. I share some of the folklore that's connected to the mountains in the area, and a lot of it is shamanic, the animistic religion that's in Korea, which often is in English they say Muism, and so it's just the animistic shamanism, the ancient religion in Korea, the only religion in Korea that's actually endemic to Korea. Oh, okay. And so I share all things like that. We visit shamanic sites that are kind of tucked away, places that you'll never see even in a Lonely Planet guide. Yeah. And we visit temples and share some stories of old legends of monks, which in Korean, like these monks with mystical powers, which are called the Gosen Chansol, and these legends of mystical monks with these superpowers and things like that. Just fascinating content, stuff that I find fascinating. That I relive hearing it for the first time again through my clients. And that's what I love about it. And so that's how the hiking tours came about. Well, that sounds awesome. And then the Dark Side of Seoul tour came about because I was developing my own ghost walk in Seoul. Okay. And I had happened to mention, just in passing, kind of mentioned it to another mutual friend of ours, Dave Hazan. Okay, I was chatting. Yeah. I was just chatting with Dave one day, and he was like, "How are your studies going? Are you still doing your studies and stuff like that?" I was like, "Yeah, you know, but I'm done, and I'm going to develop this ghost walk." And he's like, "Oh, there already is a ghost walk in Seoul." I was like, "Oh man, dang it." Well, yeah. I don't want. Yeah, I don't want to have competition. He's like, "No, it's a guy, Joe McPherson, that runs it." He said, "Just get to know him." So I contacted Joe, and we met up. Had never met before, and we're hanging out in Cheongno. We went to a craft beer house in Cheongno Samga, and over a few beers, I just talked about my ideas, a ghost walk based entirely around folklore instead of history. Mm-hmm. And he was like, "Oh, well, yeah, my Dark Side tour is based around history." So he said, "That'd be great. I have two different kind of ways of doing it." And then that was it. And then I partnered with Joe, and we've been working together since 2016. And the Dark Side of Seoul tour since then has gone to the #1 rank on TripAdvisor for the top thing to do in Seoul at night. Of 100, out of about 140 options. So we worked really hard to get to be the top tour in Seoul, the top nighttime tour in Seoul. Fantastic. And now that the world has reopened, finally, yes. That must be a real sigh of relief. Finally, I'm sure you were holding your breath for a few years there. It was awful. It was really bad. It was really, really, yeah. And I know you had your heartaches during the pandemic as well. And I mean, yeah, it was really rough. That was a rough time for the tourism industry. I know people who went almost bankrupt. Yeah. One of my colleagues. That was a really, really rough time. Absolutely. But now you're coming back from a tour, doing a tour just today. So that's great. You know, just today. Yeah. Nonstop. Yeah. So that's a thing. Like you're doing a lot of things nonstop. I hear you talk about
your podcast. Maybe I'll ask you about a couple of things right now because I hear you on the Dark
Sure.
Side of Soul podcast that you co-host with Joe, and I hear you talk about your schedule. I'm just like, holy crap, that's a lot of stuff you do. And what I'm hearing in the last few episodes, I'm hearing advertisements for your new book. So you're writing books, A Dark Side of Korea, is that right? Or Dark Side of Soul? Dark Side of Soul. There's one now. It's kind of like not in the city, but out in the country, kind of countryside things, right? Am I right?
Okay, I think maybe you're conflating some different things.
Could be. That sounds like something I do well.
So just quick as a tour, yes, I have a new tour that I started. It's going to be a springtime, and I have decided it'll be an autumn tour as well. It's a cemetery tour, and so it's up in the countryside because I live in Paju, which is an area north of Seoul, Goyang, Ilsan. I live out in the countryside, and my wife and I bought our house here 11 years ago.
Okay.
And so Korean tradition puts all of their cemeteries in the mountains.
Okay.
And there's a couple of different reasons. In the past, one of the reasons was, if people don't know, Kev, you surely remember, Korea is extremely mountainous. It's a small peninsula, and it's about, if you include North and South Korea, it's a good 75% mountainous, roughly.
Yeah.
And so arable land was considered very valuable. Mm-hmm. So nobody would want to put a cemetery on arable land because they'd be like, oh, I may want to use that later to put a new rice paddy or a new potato farm or something. And so they didn't put graves on arable land because once you put people in the ground, exhuming them would have been a cultural taboo. Mm-hmm. Very, very different. Actually, it did happen in Korean tradition. The removing of the dead, the exhuming of the dead, did happen fairly frequently. And I can share a story about that if you're interested.
Sure.
But at that time, they didn't want to have these grand cemeteries on arable land, so they put them up in the mountains. Mm. And so the cemetery tour is a light hiking tour that goes through an old cemetery where we explore folk belief and tradition behind burial, funerals, and death. And going through an old cemetery. And one of the key features is visiting a mid-15th century tomb.
Okay.
That's kind of tucked away up in the mountains and just not even known about by most people. Very, very historic place, though. So that's the countryside thing that maybe you're thinking about. The book, though, maybe you're thinking of the comic books. The Dark Side of Soul. Yeah. So the Dark Side of Soul, Weird Tales from Korean Lore, 2 comics. There's now 2 in the series. I'm a massive comic book nerd since I was a little kid, since way back in the 80s. Mm-hmm. I love comics. I've been writing comics for quite some time. I'm published in Canada and whatnot. Nothing huge, but all indie stuff. Yeah. And so I decided I wanted to write a new comic based around Korean folklore, horror tinged, scary, spooky ghost stories and things like that. And I thought, I just put the Dark Side of Soul name. When I was thinking of the title, I was like, what am I going to call it? I was like, the Dark Side of Soul, of course. So I called up Joe and I said, I got this idea. How about a Dark Side of Soul comic? So you don't have to do anything. I'll get an artist. I'll write it. I'll take care of all that. You just help me finance it. He's like, done, do it. And then that was it. And now 2 books are out. They're very popular. The most popular things I've ever written. That book we were talking about that I wrote 20 something years ago. Yeah. That no one bought that. Okay. But this is the most popular thing I've ever written, and it's doing extremely well. Coincidentally, right now we put in the order for the 3rd printing of the 2nd book, which was released in February.
Oh wow!
It's now May.
Doing really well.
We're in the 3rd. We're doing a 3rd
fantastic.
printing already.
Awesome.
Yeah, doing really well. So, And then the new book that I'm writing, though, maybe you've heard this, is I'm writing a new book about modern day ghost experiences or alleged ghost experiences in Korea. And I've done interviews with people, and I have stories dating back about 40 years, and some as recently, with some of my recent interviews, as recently as last month. So, yeah, so that's the current book that I'm writing right now.
That's very cool. I need to connect you with I don't know if he's going to listen to this. Maybe or Phil Jackson. Phil Jackson he's based in Kyoto. He's British, and he's written a lot of hiking tour books and kind of tour books called Hidden Paths of Kyoto. He's based in Kyoto,
nice.
But he's also written a fantastic book called Paranormal Kansai. And I had him on another podcast one time, and he's just tromped all around the region of Japan where I lived, collecting lots of great folklore and ghost stories, and he's a very interesting guy. So
cool.
I'll definitely get him to. I'll send you a link to his stuff. His Paranormal Concept.
Yeah, please.
Great. And Phil, if you're listening, you like this. Yeah. So that's so cool. You know, you've also got a podcast, which is where I'm hearing about these books, because again, I have not been in Korea in 15 years, 17 years. I don't know, a long time. But I, on a regular basis now, I was saying before I hit the record button, you know, that I'm listening to your podcast regularly and hearing some great things. I'm really enjoying it. So yeah, maybe you can tell the listeners a little bit about what you guys are doing with that.
Yeah. So that origin story is interesting as well. So this goes back to when COVID hit and we had a really rough time. The tourism industry just was tanked. And when COVID first came to Korea, it was January 2020. And some background first. People would book tours well in advance. So they'd plan like a summertime holiday, even a winter holiday. So we could get bookings in January for December.
Oh, okay. So and later the same year.
So yeah, and so that's a sign of a healthy travel industry. That means people are planning far in advance for a holiday. And so we had just come off 2019. We had just come off of the tour company's best year. We had our highest profits, our highest numbers. We're doing really well. And Joe and I were throwing around the idea of doing a podcast, but we didn't have time. We're like, we just don't have time to record too many tours. COVID hit and hit in late January. And by late February, every single pre-booked tour for 2020 was canceled. People were just canceling daily. We'd get the notification, canceled. And no new bookings, of course, were coming in. So within a month, all of our income for 2020 was gone. So things got pretty hairy. And so then Joe and I were thinking, okay, well, we'll have to think about how we're going to make money and survive this, you know, in another way.
Yeah.
But how are we going to let the Dark Side of Seoul survive? What are we going to do with this? Because we've built it up too big. We were already the number one tour in Seoul, number one nighttime tour in Seoul on TripAdvisor. And we're like, we can't let all of our hard work just go to waste. We better do something. And I was going to all these online conferences, Zoom conferences and stuff like that, figuring out what to do, hearing stories about other tour companies and whatnot. And then Joe and I were just chatting, and then we both agreed, the podcast, let's revisit the podcast idea. Now we have tons of time. We have plenty of time to do a podcast.
Yeah.
And that's a great way to continue to deliver content that we would like to share on a tour, but can't fit it in. There's no reference point for certain pieces of content that just wouldn't fit on a tour, but otherwise would suit what we do with the tour itself as a brand.
Yeah.
So we were like, okay, we got the tour, we got the comic, and let's now do the podcast, and we'll keep the brand in the public eye as much as we can. And so that's what we did, and that's how it started. And we've been doing, and so It started in March 2020, and we just recorded a couple days ago our 170th episode. I think it is 169th, 170th episode. It's now become, we are now ranked in the top, I can't remember the percentage. It's pretty high, like top 12 or top 10% of downloaded podcasts globally on Buzzsprout.
Oh, wow.
So pretty popular.
That's awesome.
And we're such a casual, like we're sometimes drunk, to be honest, when we're doing the episodes, or drinking or drunk.
Yeah.
Or getting drunk. And it's just such a really casual podcast, but we take it very seriously as well.
Yeah.
And we do a ton of research, and a lot of the topics we discuss is something that both of us have been immersed in for the better part of 20 years. So,
no, there's some great stuff. I mean, there's the folklore. You guys have recently been doing the history of organized crime.
It's jokes, baby. Yeah.
Your last episode was on poverty. There's a lot of things that you guys are clearly, it's not you guys just sitting around shooting the shit. I mean, in a way you're doing that, but you know your stuff. You're talking from experience, from things you've read, from the knowledge you have. So that's that definitely shines through. So again, that's why I've been enjoying.
Good.
It's a lot of fun to listen to. So everyone out there, I'll be putting a link below in the show notes.
Okay. Thanks.
This itself is a small growing podcast now, but it will be growing bigger. And for those of you listening, and listen to the Dark Side of Seoul, it's definitely worth a listen. And some great storytelling and stuff. So I'm curious for anyone who's interested in moving, going to Korea, to either move there, maybe they're going to move there and be a teacher, they're going to be working there, transfer there, whatever it may be, or they're just going to travel there. How can they find out more about these tours?
Okay, so most of our tours have their own websites. So Seoul Hike is just soulhike.com.
Okay.
And you can book directly there. Dark Side of Seoul is darksideofseoul.com. You can book directly there. Those are the individual tours. We do a bunch of other tours as well. Okay. But the company is zenkimchi.com. Zen Kimchi is the company. And then the website is zenkimchi.com.
Okay.
So you can get all of the other tours, which we have food tours. One of our most popular food tours, and now we have 3 guides doing it, is the Korean barbecue tour.
Oh, sounds
and
cool.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And the tour is good because you'll probably remember that a lot of Korean restaurants won't let people eat alone.
Yes, I do remember this. I've shared this with people before, how I can remember learning this the hard way when I first came to Korea, because I would go to restaurants and sit down. They'd be like, "No, go." I'm like,
need one more.
And I couldn't speak a word of Korean, and they couldn't speak a word of English. But they made it clear that me sitting down in that restaurant by myself wasn't going to fly.
No.
And I didn't know why. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's still like that. And it's the barbecue restaurants especially just won't serve as one person. And even if you say you're going to sit down, you're like, no, I want the order for 2. I'm going to cook everything, and then I want to take out the rest. What I won't eat. They won't do it. They're like, no, we can't do it. It's a little bit strange. I still think they're throwing money away, but Koreans are just used to that, so they know. And Koreans culturally won't eat barbecue alone.
Yeah.
You have to be with another person. It's a drinking experience.
I think in Korea, a lot of things they don't want to do alone. Like, for example, like go to a movie. I always remember that conversation coming up. People shocked when I'd say I go to a movie theater by myself to watch a movie. They're like, but it's lonely. I'm like, well, I'm not there to meet a friend or to talk. I'm there to watch a movie.
Right. And that's changed.
Oh, has
That's changed in the last 5 or more years. There's really been a shift with the younger generation where they're cool doing stuff on their own, and they want it. So, for example, drinking alone, that was considered really weird if you went to a bar by yourself, and if you at least didn't know the bartender, like if you didn't know anyone, you just went in, you sat down, ordered a drink, and in the corner reading a book. That was weird in Korea, but now they like it, and it's called 혼술. So you remember sul is alcohol. Remember sul, the word? I mean, kind of picking at you if you remember some of your Korean. So sul is alcohol. Hon is 혼자. 혼자 means alone. So
Okay.
Honsul is alone booze. uh, Honyang, Young is Younghwa, which is movie. So
Okay. Yeah.
Honja Younghwa. So Honyang, alone movie. Yeah, so it actually is turned into, there's been a shift in the last few years about that kind of thing. But not everything. So still the barbecue restaurants are like, no hon kogi. You gotta
Gotta be with people.
alone meat. You gotta be with people.
Okay.
So our barbecue tour is a good way for solo travelers who want to try real, genuine Korean barbecue, which is fantastic, and have it in Korea. Yeah, and they can't do it alone. They can join our tour, and then the guide shares the culture of the eating culture, how you pour drinks, in Korea politely, and things like that. You'll learn actually the food culture with the guides. So it's really good. So this tour is like that, and all of that is just on zenkimchi.com. So you can get all of our tours there.
Cool. Fantastic. Are you guys, I'm curious, like with regards to social media, do you have a presence like on Instagram or any of the social media places like that?
Yeah, we suck at it, but we're on there.
Okay.
And so, and it's mostly because Joe mostly handles the Facebook page, which is Dark Side of Seoul, and I handled the Instagram. And we're fairly active, but like we're also really lazy about it.
Okay. Yeah,
so
yeah, no, it's a lot of work to put into those things, right? And there's like a lot of, it's always fascinating when you meet the people who are good at it, because there's also a lot of strategy and, there's some people who really can promote their things well and really, do that with those places. I'm like that too. I have like bursts of like on an Instagram, like, oh, I'm pretty good with it for a little while. And then I forget about it. And it's like, oh yeah, I got to do that.
It's just, yeah.
It's really fascinating because now, like, for example, in a lot of places, the way the business model works, it's like that's how you drive stuff to your business. Like my sister-in-law in Japan, she's like a florist, and she has a brand new kind of startup floral arrangement shop, and she does classes and workshops, and it's basically almost everything is driven by her Instagram, which is really fascinating.
Yeah,
people
you have to have a presence. Yeah,
it's
yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, we get a lot of people who book the tours through Facebook mostly because we take out ads on Facebook.
Oh, okay, yeah,
and then there's a book button. So yeah, we'll get a lot of people who will book through different venues. But this is a good travel tip for everyone. If you're going to travel anywhere in the world, any country in the world, and you want to do tours,
okay,
so TripAdvisor, Viator, which is the same company now, Get Your Guide, any of these big OTAs, the online travel agents, they're fine. But please remember that they take a massive cut, up to 30% of the tour price.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So when you are booking a tour through TripAdvisor or any of these online agents, you are giving 30% to them and not to the tour guide. So the best thing to do is use these online sites as a search engine.
Okay.
Go on TripAdvisor, go to Seoul, type in, or just Google as well, best thing to do in Seoul, and then TripAdvisor will likely be the first thing that will come up, or like it'll be on the first page anyway.
Yeah.
And go to that link, find it, read the breakdown of the tours, find the ones that you like, then find the company name, and then search for that company name on Google. Okay. If they have a website, most of them do, go to that company's website and book directly through them. And you give 100% of your money to that tour company.
Cut out the middleman.
Cut out the middleman. And the middleman's taking 30%. It's madness. And so you'll give money directly to the tour company, which also gives most of that money to the guide itself, the guide themselves. So you will be directly supporting a worker
Yeah. That
So,
person taking you around, that person who's sharing the stories and their knowledge. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So, and not to an online agency, a lot of these agencies are corrupt anyway. And so,
Yeah. I've heard you guys talk about this topic before. That's interesting.
yeah.
I'm always very fascinated with tourism and that kind of. I listened to a podcast based out of Japan called the Seeking Sustainable Japan podcast with JJ Walsh.
Cool.
And she's a tourism ambassador and does a lot of inbound tourism. And she has a lot of people on and experts constantly discussing like sustainable tourism and stuff like that. And they do talk a lot about really interesting things. Maybe that's because I grew up in Lewisburg with my parents being employees of the Fortress of Lewisburg National Historic Park, all tourism stuff. It was just like the talk that was always happening. Right. People always lamented that the Fortress Lewisburg was at the end of the highway, so people didn't want to go there. And then you had the whole thing that went on for years where people would go to the fortress, but they didn't want to stop in the town of Lewisburg and spend any money there, so they just kind of passed through. But it's an interesting topic for sure. Well, Shawn, thank you so much for stopping by the podcast. Thanks, I definitely appreciate it. It's like 10:30 p.m. where you are. I know that I'm an early to bed kind of person myself, mostly because I teach kindergarten, so I have no choice.
Oh,
yeah, that's what I'm doing.
And you do have to work, and you have to work tomorrow. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of little people that wait for me, and I'm usually I'm in my classroom between 6:30 and 6:50 in the morning.
Oh wow.
Oh yeah, the kids arrive around 7:50, but I need to prepare for the day ahead and brace myself. I don't know. Maybe that's
right.
Yeah, for the inevitable craziness that is. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Shawn. It's been awesome to catch up, and I'm really happy you took the time to come on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I want to thank Shawn for taking the time to stop by the Just Asia podcast. Go over to check out all the links below. They're all in the show notes at darksideofseoul.com. Check out the podcast, The Dark Side of Seoul. Go follow it wherever you listen to podcasts. Again, all the links are below. Go check out what they are doing over in Korea. It's really cool. And again, thank you, Shawn, for taking the time to stop by the Just Asia podcast. Really appreciate it. It's great to catch up with an old friend, someone I know in person, used to have drinks with, lots of great conversations with many years ago. For all of you fine folks out there listening, you gotta follow us, the Just Asia podcast, on the social medias. Follow me on Instagram at JLandKev to see what I'm up to. Check out my nature photography on Instagram at Shizen Wildlife. Go follow the Facebook page, facebook.com/justjapanstuff. This is a carry on over of the Just Japan podcast, the same style of podcast with a much broader scope being Just Asia. I want to thank all of the support. You guys have been extremely supportive. The audience grows, the listens grow, the downloads grow. Please share this podcast with folks that you know who would be interested in these kind of stories, who are interested in travel, adventures in Asia, all of that cool stuff. So there you go. Updates for me, not a lot at the moment. We're on the home stretch. We're going to be leaving China in just a few weeks from now. So many things to do. Don't want to bore you with all the details. Tax stuff, banking stuff, shipping company stuff, finishing up work. While we have really good health insurance, making lots of trips to the doctor and the dentist, all of those things, trying to get all that, milk as much of that as we can while we're here. And then we will be off the second week of June to Japan for a month, then to Canada, and then off to Penang, Malaysia, where we start the next chapter of our lives. I'm really excited. My family's excited. It's going to be exciting. And we'll take you along for the ride. This summer, I'm not sure exactly what some of the podcasts will look like. I may be jumping back to the model sometimes, some weeks of a solo episode, or me with my son Kai, that kind of thing, because we will be living in Airbnbs. So we'll see how that goes. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, that's it. Again, help us grow. Please leave a review and a rating wherever you listen to podcasts, and share us on social media. Share us on your Twitter, your Instagram, share us on your Facebook. If you're a member of any Facebook groups, do that. Help us grow. Tell your friends all about us, the Just Asia podcast. All right. Well, that's it for another week. My name's Kevin O'Shea, a Canadian who has been living in Asia for 21 years. And each week I bring to you a fantastic guest who shares with you an amazing life that they're living here in Asia. All right, guys. Well, that's it. And wherever you are in the world, hope you're happy, hope you're healthy. And of course, check all those links below and follow us all over the place. All right. Be talking to you soon.